Good evening. I want to welcome you all here tonight. Thank you for coming. Thank you for those who were here last night and came back again. We have much better weather for you today, so I hope it was a little bit easier to get out. My name is Melissa Kirshner, and I am a member of White Voices Against Racism. Tonight is the second part of a four-part series, and our topic tonight is going to be on environmental justice. We're very happy to have some great speakers tonight, so I know you will enjoy them. Last night's program was on residential segregation, and I think if you were here, you could tell others that are first-timers tonight what a great group, what a great event we had last night, being able to have a good conversation. We also have two events coming up in May. There's more information about those outside. You'll hear a little bit more from us about those later. But we do encourage you to come back and join us for those. They're going to be at the Magnolia House. But again, you'll hear more about those later. Oh yeah, I forgot to do that again. This is me. Want to thank all of our many wonderful sponsors and community partners. We could not have done this without those folks, and we want to appreciate them very much. Want to thank UNCG and the MPA program for giving us this space last night and tonight, and for providing some food and beverage outside. I am a graduate of the MPA program, so if you want to get involved and aren't already, let me know, and welcome to the students. It is good to graduate. You will make it. So this is Voices for Change. Change is a process, and what you're going to see is three parts to that. Learn, engage, and act. Social Justice Bazaar, that's what we're calling what we had upstairs. That will be going on again afterwards for just a little while if you want to go get some information. We have a great bookseller here. We have books and t-shirts for sale. Please feel free to get any information up there before you leave. So going back to our three parts of our process, learn, engage, and act, we're going to start our evening with learn.
In the United States, the environmental justice movement started primarily in the southeastern states, expanding from the civil rights movement of the 1960s.
Hold on, let me make sure this is as loud as possible. One more time.
In the United States, the environmental justice movement started primarily in the southeastern states, expanding from the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Local residents began sounding the alarm about public health dangers in their communities. One important example took place in 1982 when residents of Warren County, North Carolina protested the construction of a toxic PCB landfill in a majority African American community. They told officials that the landfill would make their water unsafe to use. Other environmental injustices have been institutional. During the era of segregation prior to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, many state and local governments worked to restrict people of color to living in certain neighborhoods. Mortgage lenders, neighborhood associations, and municipalities used various racist policies to limit where people of color were allowed to live or buy property. This system, called redlining, also reduced the political power of these neighborhoods, which prevented those communities from accessing environmental services like trash pickup and sewage systems. Such forced segregation is illegal now, but these communities are still suffering from the environmental disparities that were put in place. Today, there are new inequities being created. For instance, physical infrastructure like landfills, highways, and wastewater plants that cause noise and air pollution are more likely to be built in communities of color. But these same communities do not have easy access to public amenities like greenways and parks that provide social and mental health benefits. In the coming years, climate change will only increase the disparities caused by environmental injustice. Climate change will damage crops through droughts and floods, cause heat-related illness, and increase heating and cooling bills. Communities with lower incomes and higher minority populations will bear a disproportionate share of these costs. Leaders should help their communities strive for the EPA's goal of equal protection for all from environmental and health hazards, an equal say in the decisions that create a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work.
So with that, I would like to ask our first two speakers to give their presentations. First up will be Jasmine Washington. She's the Associate Attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center. And then following her will be Omega Wilson, who is co-founder of the West End Revitalization Association.
Can y'all hear me okay? Okay, this is my first time ever wearing lapel mics. I feel so fancy. My name is Jasmine Washington. I'm an associate attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center. And I am gonna talk to y'all for a little bit about environmental justice in North Carolina. First, a little bit about Southern Environmental Law Center. We're the largest legal advocacy organization for the environment in the Southeast. We are place-based, we are rooted in the South. And we fought for over 40 years actually, to ensure clean water, clean air, protection for wildlife and for people throughout the region. This evening, I will be, like I said, focusing on environmental justice in North Carolina. Believe it or not, the 20 or so minutes that I will be speaking up here is not enough to fully dive into every environmental justice issue that communities of color and poor communities around the state face. But I'm hoping to provide a little bit of background and kind of a primer and give some examples of what these practices look like across the state. So first, I'm gonna talk about what is environmental justice exactly. Then I'll give some examples of what environmental justice looks like. Then discuss some of the legal tools that we use to address and advance environmental justice. And then I will pass the mic over to Mr. Omega Wilson to talk about the wonderful work that he and his organization do to address environmental injustice in their community. So first, what is environmental justice? Y'all that was an excellent video, Mark, that really hit the highlights and really helped define the issues and concerns that we think about when it comes to environmental justice. But I will say there are a lot of definitions of environmental justice. Oftentimes people are looking for kind of, short, pithy, like one-line definitions of environmental justice, but complex issues and complex problems have complex definitions and complex ways of looking at them. So there are a lot of definitions for environmental justice. The particular definition used in any situation would depend on the audience, so who you're advocating before. It would depend on the exact issue, and it would depend on kind of the facts of your case in particular. So I have up here though the definition that you can find in Executive Order 14096. This was President Biden's executive order that he signed last spring to recommit to reaffirm the federal government's commitment to advance environmental justice. And in this executive order, he adopts what he calls a whole of government approach to advancing and addressing environmental justice across the country. So to read that definition, it defines environmental justice as the just treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of income, race, color, national origin, tribal affiliation, or disability, in agency decision-making and other federal activities that affect human health and the environment. Once again, that is not a universal definition. It's actually only a portion of the definition that's in the executive order, but I think it sort of encompasses a lot of what the movement sort of seeks to do. I'll also add that this is a similar definition. It's almost identical to the definition that you would find in North Carolina's executive order. So that's Executive Order 292 that Governor Cooper signed into order back in October. So now that we've talked about definitions, I would like to talk about the goals of environmental justice. So I have on the screen, these are just 3 of the 17 principles for environmental justice. So these principles came out of the first national, let me make sure I get it right, the first National Peoples of Color Leadership Summit that was held in Washington, D.C. in 1991. That was a group of people who had been organizing around environmental justice issues for decades, coming together and kind of coming up with goals and principles for this overall movement. I chose to highlight these three in this presentation just because, as an environmental attorney, a lot of our work is dealing with environmental permitting. And so I feel like these principles really kind of highlight the role of permitting and agency decision-making can have in advancing environmental justice and potential barriers that they present in addressing environmental injustices. So Principle 4 states that environmental justice calls for universal protection from nuclear testing, extraction, production, and disposal of toxic and hazardous waste and poison, and nuclear testing that threaten the fundamental right to clean air, land, water, and food. Principle 6 states that environmental justice demands the cessation of production of all toxins, hazardous waste, and radioactive materials, and that all past and current producers be held strictly accountable to the people for detoxification and the containment at the point of production. And then lastly, Principle 17 states that environmental justice requires that we as individuals make personal and consumer choices to consume as little of Mother Earth's resources and to produce as little waste as possible, and make the conscious decision to challenge and reprioritize our lifestyles to ensure the health of the natural world for present and future generations. So like I said, I think that those principles really sort of big picture highlight what the goals of environmental justice are, specifically as it relates to environmental law. I think they also highlight the fact that environmental justice is not about putting the waste somewhere else. So I kind of want to dispel that myth that, it's not about take the hazardous waste from the poor black community and put it in the wealthy white community. Environmental justice is about questioning whether that waste should exist, what the industry that is producing that waste is doing, whether we need that, and puts the burden on that industry or that polluter to take care of their waste so that no community has to bear the burden of that pollution. So I just want to make that clear. That's often sort of a concern that people raise is, oh, isn't this just a new form of NIMBYism? But if you turn to, the goals and sort of a portion of what I would call the origin of the movement, that is certainly not the case. I'll also add that I encourage all of you to Google and look up the remaining principles of environmental justice because they're just really neat and I think provide a great model for how we can create a more just and equitable world. So now I want to talk about what environmental injustice actually looks like. And so I have two examples that I want to talk through for that. So the YouTube video that Mark just showed really kind of laid some foundation and touched on the practice of redlining. And so I thought I would speak about what that sort of looks like in our own backyard. So redlining is the systematic denial of services such as mortgages, insurance loans, and other financial services to residents of certain areas based on their race or ethnicity. So this on the screen is the zoning map for the city of Greensboro in 1936. It's a little hard to actually read some of the street signs, but anybody who's from Greensboro or knows Greensboro, you can kind of get the vibe. I'm a graduate of North Carolina A&T, so you can kind of the map. You can kind of place where things are by just looking at it. So this was the zoning map, and this was the red-lined map of the city of Greensboro in 1936. The green and the blue sections, those were areas that were deemed ideal for financial services. Those were areas where you could get, where utility hookups were happening. Those were areas where you could get mortgages and mortgage insurance and all those sorts of financial services that we think of today as being kind of required to build a safe, quote-unquote, nice community. Those were largely only available in those green and blue areas. Where we actually get the name redlining is because the red areas on the map are the areas that were deemed, let me get my language straight, definitely declining or hazardous. So the red in particular were the areas that were considered hazardous for investment. So those were communities wherein it was extremely difficult or impossible to get mortgages, to get different types of insurance, to get different utility hookups and public services. And it is no coincidence that the areas in red and yellow were the communities that people of color lived, while the areas that were in green and blue were the areas where only white families were allowed to reside. And so some of you might be thinking that like, okay, cool, Jasmine, this was a map from 1936. It is almost 100 years later. Surely things are like way different now. But in fact, this is a map that I pulled this week from EPA's Environmental Justice Screening Tool. Another tool that I recommend people check out. You can look at all sorts of demographic data, public health information for areas for free on EPA's website. So just the human eye, you can look at it and tell that those areas that were once redlined, where people of color were only allowed to live, you will notice that those are still the areas where people of color are largely living. So the map at the bottom of your screen is from EJ Screen, and it shows the percent people of color population. So the darker the red color, the more people, the higher percentile of people of color. And you can see that there's an overlay in the communities that were redlined in 1936, and those same communities still being largely comprised of people of color today. This map in your top corner, I pulled from the City of Greensboro's zoning website this week. And you will also notice that there are a lot of areas that are still zoned for hazardous waste and hazardous activities that are in the areas that were once redlined for people of color, and that are now still largely resided in by people of color. And so the purple area on the map, I don't know how easily y'all can read it from up there, but those purple areas, those are areas that are zoned for hazardous waste. I believe those orange areas are for different manufacturing processes, and you can just sort of see that there's that kind of looking northwest of the city center. That is largely still single-family residentially zoned, just as it was largely back in 1936. So once again, you might be asking, cool, Jasmine, what is this, like, what else does this actually show us? These are two other maps that I pulled from EJ Screen, one mapping the low life expectancy percentiles and the asthma rates. And once again, you will see that those communities that were once redlined, where hazardous waste is still zoned and allowed to operate, there are a higher percentile of low life expectancy and rates of asthma. So I bring all this up and say all this, that this is an environmental justice, or an example of environmental injustice that is literally in our backyard here. Decisions that were made 100 years ago are still having impacts on communities and people of color today. And so coming into environmental justice work, that is a really important context to remember. Oftentimes, communities of color and people of color have a lot of different or kind of elevated or increased health risk, and oftentimes that is based on where one has resided your entire life. If you had been raised in a city that was redlined, where you and your parents grew up around hazardous waste, it stands to reason that your health is going to be impacted in the long term. And so I just wanted to bring, kind of bring this example home of that, North Carolina and Greensboro are not unique in this. This redlining was practiced throughout cities in the South. There are maps like this for Greensboro, there's maps like this for Durham, and so most cities that had zoning in the Jim Crow area, you will find similar trends. So now I would like to give another, another example of environmental injustice that exists today. So this is a map of the town of Baden, North Carolina. It's a small town in Stanley County along the Yadkin River, and it was founded as a company town by the Aluminum Company of America, or Alcoa, in the early 1900s. This company really recruited for people to come populate this town in order to run and operate an aluminum smelting operation. So creating aluminum is a very resource-intensive process. It produces a lot of hazardous waste and it requires a lot of energy. So Alcoa set up shop in Baden and recruited people to come have those jobs. That includes recruiting African Americans to come to those communities to do those jobs. And so these are newspaper ads that were put out in order to encourage Black people to come and move to what they called the Colored Village, where they could get a house, work for 10 years, and pay off that house. You'll notice that I circled part of the map of Baden in red. That's because that is the side of community known as West Baden, and that was the Colored Village. So the people who answered that call and came to town to get these jobs at Alcoa, the Black people were relegated to West Baden, while the white people were moved to East Baden, to East Baden. And there's a road that goes through town that splits the sides of town. And you'll see from the map, the Alcoa's footprint, which is that space in that kind of light purple, that is Alcoa's footprint. And you'll see right below it, there's a hazardous waste landfill. All of that is considered to be in West Baden. So Alcoa, for nearly 100 years, operated in Baden. If you speak to members of concerned citizens of West Baden who worked for Alcoa, I mean, they can tell you story after story of the discriminatory employment practices that Alcoa deployed against them. They often speak about how the Black employees were given the most hazardous and dirty jobs. Like I mentioned, producing aluminum. This was a primary aluminum smelting operation. It is a very hazardous production process. It's very hot. There's a lot of really dangerous compounds that you come in contact with, and those were the jobs that were given to the Black employees there. Part of that also created a lot of hazardous waste that had to be disposed of. And so for decades, Alcoa disposed of the waste how they wanted to. And most of it, or a lot of it, ended up in unlined landfills around town. Today, Alcoa says that all of their hazardous waste is in, those colored sites on the map. But when you speak to people who worked at Alcoa, they will tell you about the different places around town that Alcoa told them to bury hazardous waste. You'll also see, if you go to West Baden, if you kind of drive around, you'll see some people, there's like different colored bricks, the foundation of people's houses, or for retaining walls, or kind of for garages and things like that. They'll be kind of black and like white and kind of purplish and just kind of this little brick rainbow of colors. And even though you might see it and think like, oh, how fun, it is not fun. Those are actually bricks that were used in the aluminum smelting process that are loaded with hazardous waste that Alcoa would give to the Black community members to use in the foundation of their homes. And so quite literally, I mean, these are houses that are built on materials that are hazardous waste all throughout town. So today, back in 2007, Alcoa closed up shop and shipped this operation over to Iceland, and left its buildings and all of its waste where it was laid. And so what we have now, if you take a look at this map, all those kind of teal colored dots that kind of line the kind of curve around Alcoa's footprints, those are all outfalls where Alcoa is allowed to release the wastewater and stormwater that comes through its facility. That liquid is loaded with pollutants that are being released into Baden Lake, which is on the Yadkin River, and into Little Mountain Creek, which is you can't see it on this map, but it's a small creek that's right below the hazardous waste landfill. They are releasing the waste into those bodies of water. People swim in Baden Lake. Little Mountain Creek flows into Lake Tillery, which is where communities downstream get their drinking water from. And so community members from West Baden have been advocating for years to have Alcoa clean up, particularly their hazardous waste sites, and remediate the other sites across their footprint, because it is impacting their health and it is impacting their communities. They tell a story of a couple years ago, there was a fire, I believe it was a methane leak of some sort, at the landfill that literally burned for like a month. And there are people's homes that are not too far from this hazardous landfill. And so, I know we're going to talk about this a little later, but if you're looking for ways to get involved, and one thing you can do is help the concerned citizens of West Baden advocate in their call to have this hazardous waste cleaned up. Any day now, we should be receiving a draft water permit for Alcoa. They have what's called a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES permit, that allows them to release wastewater and stormwater from their landfill and from their old operation. That permit allows them to do that and puts very limited restrictions on how much of specific pollutants they are allowed to release. So we are waiting for a new draft of that permit to come out any day now. Their current permit expired 2 years ago now. It expired back in 2022. So in September 2022. So we are waiting for that permit to come out. And so we've been asking DEQ to go ahead and release that permit, because we can't take action until we have some sort of permit or something to advocate or push around. So if you're looking for some sort of action item, I encourage you to reach out to DEQ and demand that they release the NPDES permit so that the community can begin to take some sort of action to address at least that part of the pollution they're surrounded with. So next I want to talk about some of the legal tools that we use to advance environmental justice. So firstly, traditional environmental laws do still exist in the context of environmental justice. Whether they're seen as environmental justice tools really, depends on how they're wielded. You can use the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and all those things to still help poor communities and Black and Latino indigenous communities to advance and address the pollution in their communities. I'll also call out specifically the North Carolina Solid Waste Management Act. That statute actually has an express provision in it that requires the state to look at the cumulative impacts whenever they're citing a hazardous waste management site. So that includes things like landfills. Civil rights law is also one of the tools that we use in environmental justice work. I'll talk about it in a little while, and I know Mr. Wilson will dive into it a little more. But Title VI of the Civil Rights Act is one of the civil rights tools that communities have used for several decades to try to address pollution and injustices in their community. We also have executive orders. I mentioned before Executive Order 14096. That is President Biden's initiative to adopt a whole-of-government approach to advancing environmental justice. Before that, he also signed Executive Order 14, I can't remember the number. He signed another executive order that began his Justice 40 initiative. And that is an initiative that aims to deliver 40% of the government's benefits to communities of color and underserved communities across the country. There's also state and federal commissions that you can advocate before. So in North Carolina, we have the Governor's Environmental Justice Advisory Council. That was created under the Executive Order 292. And that is a body of both representatives from cabinet state agencies and members of the public who work on environmental justice issues that have been called together to kind of come up with a number, they have a list of priorities, but to come up with a number of things to address environmental justice across the state. Similarly, at the federal level, there's the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council and the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So these are all bodies that, they don't necessarily have regulatory authority or anything like that, but in an attempt to elevate a particular concern, it can be really helpful and powerful to go before these bodies. Lastly, we also have local laws and ordinances. There's not great examples of this across North Carolina, but a number of municipalities in other states have implemented different environmental justice related ordinances, particularly related to zoning. So touching again on traditional environmental law as a tool, I just want to highlight that there is not a specific environmental justice law. We have a Clean Air Act, we have a Clean Water Act, we have, RCRA, but there's not a clear environmental justice law. But like I mentioned before, the traditional environmental laws can be used to address environmental injustice. But also recognize that environmental permitting practices that are allowed under those traditional environmental laws can also create environmental injustices in themselves. I mentioned the Alcoa example, but that is not a standalone example. The Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act and statutes like that, ultimately, they do still allow you to pollute. They are in essence permits to pollute. They just say that you can only do it in a certain amount. But nonetheless, if you have multiple polluting facilities who all have permits and they're all concentrated in communities of color or in poor communities, yes, the environmental laws are limiting the amount they can release, but when you have the cumulative impacts and cumulative effects of all of those pollutions in a small area, that is where environmental injustices are born. I also want to touch a little more on Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I just want to set everybody up a little bit for what Mr. Wilson is going to talk about. He's going to talk about how his organization used this legal tool to fight off some I'll let him talk about it, some pretty powerful and what would have been some true injustices in his community. So Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 states that anybody who if you receive federal funding from the federal government, you are not allowed to discriminate based on race or color or national origin in any of your programming or activities. If there's a case of intentional discrimination, so where, for instance, an agency or an organization that received a grant from the federal government, if they kind of set out and intentionally treated a group differently based on their color, that is a claim that you're allowed to file in federal court and have a federal judge address and go through that process. But for cases of unintentional discrimination, which is called disparate impact discrimination, those happen when the actions of somebody who received federal fundings have the effect of causing discrimination, regardless of their intent. So this is where Title VI is often used in the environmental justice context, is cases of unintentional discrimination, but where several of the type of facility or several polluting operations have been placed in a community of color and is causing a disproportionate harm to that community. That is where Title VI is oftentimes used to address it. However, for cases of disparate impact or unintentional discrimination, those cases cannot be filed in federal court. Those cases are filed as complaints before the federal agency that provided the funding. And how it's supposed to work is that the federal agency investigates the case, and if discrimination is found, then the recipient of that federal funding has to either prevent or mitigate or kind of dampen the discriminatory impacts that will occur. Lastly, I just want to present y'all with some other resources that you can look into if you're just curious to learn about environmental justice. The Environmental Justice State by State website lists all the different environmental justice related statutes and laws in all 50 states. You can click on your state and it pulls up any executive actions or statutes or regulations that are related to environmental justice in that state. The second document I have up here is EPA's interim guidance on Title VI and environmental justice, and it really lays out a lot about Title VI, about EPA's authority to look at and kind of consider and regulate environmental justice. And so I think it's kind of a good public tool to start to kind of, wrap your head around some of the concepts related to environmental justice, specifically with environmental permitting. Lastly, this is information about the Environmental Justice Thriving Community Technical Assistance Centers. Those are centers that are located across the country, and they're intended to provide technical assistance to organizations that are interested in grants from the federal government to address environmental justice. So they fall under that Justice 40 initiative that I mentioned before. These centers are intended to provide technical assistance to help organizations go after that 40% of federal funding. The closest one to here is at RTI International, which is located in RTP right outside of Raleigh. And they partnered with a number of other organizations to create these technical centers in hopes of educating the public and helping organizations seek funding. So I think this was my last slide. Yes, it is. So now I'm going to turn the mic over to someone that I actually look up to, Mr. Omega Wilson. He is the co-founder of the Weston Revitalization Organization. Like I mentioned, they have done some amazing work fighting environmental injustice and have really kind of set a standard that is really revered, I think, across the nation for the work that they've been able to do and accomplish in Alamance County. So I'm sorry, I don't know if Mark, if you were going to do an introduction, but.
Yeah, I appreciate you.
Okay, so yeah,
Thank you. So glad to be here. Thank you, Attorney Washington, Mark, and family. Listen. First of all, a couple of three housekeeping things. We have a website with our digital archive of a lot of documents we've accumulated since our organization started in 1994. And since my wonderful wife for 49 years is not able to be here tonight, she's doing some work for the United Church of Christ. So I'm going to be part of her presentation that we usually do tag team, right? Our website location, I'm going to give it to you, is very short, so I ask you not to look at it while I'm presenting, if you don't mind. A lot of tremendous history, because of course we're neighboring counties, Alamance and Guilford County. It is weranc.org, weranc.org, okay? The other housekeeping thing is the EJ screening tool that Jasmine talked about earlier. Starting in 2007, I was invited to be a part of a team that put that EJ screening tool together as a member of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council for the federal government out of Washington, D.C. We worked on it 2007 to 2010, right? So there are other versions of it that's been updated, but I was one of the community people who were asked to be a part of structuring that, okay? Let's see. Okay. Now, in recent years, we have been a part of a group called the Citizen Science Association. And the Citizen Science Association recently has changed its name to the Association for Advancement of Participatory Sciences in order to incorporate science and data that's collected by community groups like our group, the Western Revitalization Association, not by universities, not by federal government, because community groups most often, like IE West Baden, they know where things are, they know the streets, the names of people, the churches, the companies who work in the factories, they know the landfills, etc. That very often academics, university people do not know, and we call it community science. So this particular group has organizations and offices in Europe and Australia, as well as the United States. So they contacted us a few years ago as a part of a international meeting that was held in Raleigh in 2000, at the Convention Center in 2019, in March of 2019 for a week. And we were asked, our organization was asked to recruit people of color from all over the country, from Alaska to Puerto Rico. And they were funded to come for that week. And it was designed to help diversify this particular meeting of over 800 people from 28 countries in all 50 states, right? And we were selected to be the person, an organization, to kind of vet and approve these invitees. Gender diversity, religious diversity, racial diversity, etc. Ethnic diversity, tribal diversity, to this particular meeting. And it was one of the biggest of its kind ever held in the world. So we continue to work with them. So we try to create some language that we can share. And some of this language we've shared in various presentations with the federal government, universities, lawyers, American Bar Association, etc. So very often people will try to give us a page, give us a flat sheet that we can take with us that we can share and use. So this is one of the ones we came up with about a year ago. And it's called Jedis. And a lot of the young people say, oh, Star Wars. And we get their attention, right? Because we did this at high school. And Wheaton High School in Allen County about 3 or 4 weeks ago said, no, not that Jedi, but at least we get their attention. And what does it mean? Jedi, of course, is justice, equity, diversity, inclusion with integrity and funding. So Jedis, small eyes. So this is a kind of like a template of what a lot of black and brown communities are looking for. Justice in removing injustices, i.e. West Baton. Equity in restoring the community. How do you clean it up and make it better? Diversity is who are you looking at, who are you addressing, black, indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color. Very often people say people of color. We like to say it. We like to, actually identify who the people we're talking about. And inclusion at all levels, because the community people can't do this by themselves. You have to incorporate the partners, black, white, government, even some of the people you're fighting against have to be in the room who are causing the trouble or creating barriers. With integrity, it has to be integrity. We can't be in a meeting room like this where everybody's yelling and screaming and, making derogatory comments at each other. There has to be some kind of integrity in the process for collaborative partnerships. And the other thing is, you can't get things very much done for cleanup unless you have money involved, whether it's local money, state money, travel money. There's money designated to clean up various kinds of sites and various kinds of pollution. So remember Jedis. You'll be able to find it on your internet before long, right? We've been using this to help train some federal officers because we've been asked to help train federal officers. EPA officers did a brand new, because we've been doing this for 30-some years, so we have some they call them brand new hires for the federal government. So on more than one occasion, we have been asked, my wife and I, my son Ida, who works with us, to come in and actually train brand new federal officers on what environmental justice is, because some of them were in elementary school when we started this. So they know it when they see it on paper, but they don't know it touching, feeling, smelling, or the people who actually are directly involved in it. As I mentioned earlier, that's my wife, married in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in 1974, okay? From 2007 to 2010, I served as a community perspective member of the United States Environmental Protection Agency's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and with contributions on a thing called goods movement recommendations. That's how you move goods products by plane, road, train, port. And of course, unfortunately, we saw some of that goods movement kill a bridge in Baltimore, right? That's goods movement. All that stuff on that, that barge or that boat, that ship was goods. So I worked on a committee that specifically dealt with how to reduce or eliminate hazards and contamination related to goods movement in the environmental justice community. So that is a real light one, because we have some indigenous people who were killed. And we have some water that's been polluted, and a lot of people who will be cleaning it up for years are going to be low income, minority people of color, who are going to be cleaning up the waste in the aftermath. In 1995, the Western Revitalization Association was incorporated as a 501c3 nonprofit to deal with, address the denial of safe drinking water, sewer access, paved streets, stormwater infrastructure, and displacement by a highway construction through black and brown indigenous communities in North Carolina, where we live, where my family was raised, where my ancestors were buried, and where slaves were technically freed in 1865, right? Okay? That particular community was one of those communities that is not unlike a lot of communities in the south of North Carolina. Well, if you found where the trash pile is, or the land pile, if you found where the cesspool at that time in the 1800s and the early 1900s, it is now called the sewage treatment plant, where there was just a big giant hole in the ground and everybody on a daily basis disposed of their human waste out of their homes. That's where you would almost always find a black community. And that's where West End is. That's where I grew up, my family grew up. And that is representative of what you find throughout the South. You find those three locations almost in the same places. In 1999, the West End Revitalization Association filed a complaint with the United States Department of Justice under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and we referenced the Environmental Justice Executive Order 12898, the one that Jasmine mentioned earlier is more recent, coming out of the Biden-Harris administration. But this one was the first one in 1994 that was signed by President Bill Clinton at the request of Al Gore, his vice president, because Al Gore was an environmentalist before he was even elected. And this was one of the first things that Bill Clinton did, because Al Gore asked him, we want this done. But it was kind of buried, right? So we referenced this executive order when we filed our complaint in 1999. This is only 5 years after the executive order was written, right? And of course, it's been updated by the Biden-Harris administration. The Department of Justice described our situation as a denial of rights to basic amenity due to a historic pattern of racial discrimination. I mean, that's what we're here to talk about now, this family racial barriers. And the Department of Justice withheld federal funds from the City of Midland, Alamance County, and the state of North Carolina to encourage mitigation without litigation, right? To encourage the state of North Carolina and Midland to pave residential streets, to open dead-end streets that had never been paved since slavery ended. So in the community where I grew up, West End, and another one called White Level, where it was partially indigenous population, mixed race, streets had never been paved, even though in West End the width of this building from the sewage treatment plant, black residents had never been allowed to tap onto it. So they were still having septic tanks that were leaking in the back of their yards and had been for decades and decades and decades. So streams and ditches and were contaminated with human waste and had been for decades that hadn't been addressed, and it was a public health issue, right? So the Department of Justice gave us a name for it, and I've never heard the description before: denial of the right of basic amenities due to a historic pattern of racial discrimination. I wrote that down in 1999, right? When I was supposed to be selling insurance, but I was doing this at the same time. Now, environmental justice is something a lot of local people just didn't see. They didn't understand the language, they never heard it before. They knew about discrimination, racial discrimination, they knew about racism, they heard that, they knew what they lived with that. But they saw it as kind of a simple way. This is what we're dealing with here is we just need to go down to the city council, down to the commissioner. These are black folks, and talk to the white official and they'll help us change this and help improve it. That's all we need to do. Simple. And then we have an analogy for it when we talk to community groups of 12 and sometimes 100 and some people in the community trying to explain it. And it was kind of like, okay, you got a mouse, you either capture it or kill it, right? It's a small tail sticking out a hole in the wall. And we use this to talk to federal government officials so they can visually see it. So sometimes it takes a visual, a flat screen for people to be able to see things. But and addressing it from a simple point of view is we talk to local officials and get them to understand, and that's how we'll solve it. But racism doesn't work that way, right? So the community perspective was relatively simple. But when we start talking to federal government people, they described to us it wasn't that simple. It's not that simple. So we had to create a visual because we talk about this so much from Atlanta to Washington to California. So we said, well, we got to create something that people can see and remember. So a lot of people ask us, can you bring back this image? Can you bring it back? And some of the federal officers said, we want you to use this to help train some of our government officers so they can see the dynamics of what you're talking about. So we said, well, in this particular case, what you're dealing with is something you have to confront and train because you can't kill an elephant. And the government is an elephant. It is complex and complicated. And this was a term that was shared to me personally in a meeting with the EPA Administrator Lisa Perez Jackson. She was the first person of color woman to be an EPA Administrator for the federal government. This is preceding Michael Regan, of course, who's from North Carolina. Graduated from AT, by the way, I think he'd already knew that. And in a meeting in her conference room with a handful of other EJ officers, environmental justice leaders from different parts of the country, she invited us in 2008, right after President Obama was elected, right, to talk to her. So we were a small group of people who were asked to talk to her about how to address environmental justice issues. So this is something she referred to our community as dealing with. The situation is not just complicated, it's complex. And I said, what in the world are you talking about? But anyhow, that's the EJ ghost is coming.
Don't let anyone in.
There's nobody there. All right, thanks, Mark. But anyhow, the government regulations and industrial pollution are often the elephant's tail, but it always has a large backside, right? Some people think that's funny and humorous, but it's reality. Can't kill the elephant. As we learn the process going to Washington, D.C., Department of Justice, he said, well, how do you train elephants? There are herds of them. And every elephant represents a different branch of the federal government. There are 18 major branches of the federal government, including the Department of Defense, the military, housing, agriculture, EPA, Department of Justice, et cetera, et cetera. So you can enumerate them all. You can Google them and say, what are the 18 branches of the government, and then come up. But we will realize the environmental justice story is like a herd of elephants. They are polluters as well as responsible for cleaning up the ecosystem. And elephants do exactly that. They make waterways and create lakes and streams, but they also create a massive amount of degradation in the environment. So we refer to this as the people and the agencies that regulate and supposedly restore the 4 Bs, the birds, the bees, the butterflies, and the human being. But sometimes they kill all of these things while they're supposed to be protecting them, right? It's great irony in our life. In our way of trying to come up with a way of talking and sharing this information with other people, we had to put ourselves in the center. You see the acronym there, the paradigm. We were project manager, me, at the time, and our steering committee. And we had to look at how we get rid of institutional racism. It's in cultural silos. And this particular paradigm was something that we were asked to do by EPA official. Is that we need to see this and we want you to put it together so we can share it with your permission with other agencies, upline, downline, other agencies, because we need to take your story in a relatively simple way, you know, like a page or two, as they say, the business card, give it to me in a business card, and I can share it with, you know, 1,000 or 10,000 people, and of course with the internet now, you can share it with millions of people. But there are 9 circles here quickly, and one is the community. We're going left of circling around from the community, you know, like a clock. The communities around Mebane, all the North Carolina communities, the public health structure at the state level and federal level, the legal community, i.e. the Southern Environmental Law Center, and of course we have all these other agencies and nonprofits and other government agencies that are there. But they work in silos, like these bubbles. If you look down in silos, I know, how many of you have ever seen a silo on a farm? I think somebody should be able to raise their hand and see the silo, right? You've ever seen a silo. You look down from the top, you see these circles, right? And silos, even though they're right next to each other, they don't necessarily communicate with each other very well. So the term silo was something that was given to me by federal officers in Washington, D.C. All of these branches of government, even though they're responsible for protecting our rights in Mebane, this is our Mebane story, we work on silos, and the person who's offended has to go to each silo. The silos do not talk to each other. So this is divided by a lack of trust within the silos, even in the federal government, at the state and local level, because they operate the same way at the state level. So racism in place, it stays in the silo, and it's institutionalized and fermented, not just at local level, but the federal level, from silo to silo. And this is geography too, from state to state, from county to county. And it's also done in educational language, right? It's also done based on privilege to pain. If I have privilege, I can go from one silo to silo, but if you're in a painful community, you have to get a ticket to get in the silo to communicate, and you may never get in there. The ground truthing part is get you out of the silo so you can come and look at my community and see what's actually going on. And even if you live in Raleigh, and I'm in Mebane 25 miles, 35 miles away, it's a hell of a time getting a government agency to come to Mebane and actually physically look at what I'm trying to tell you for the last 3 years. Getting people out of the silo is a hell of a job, and it's always been. The other one is the fail or no policy. In our case, we had civil rights laws, environmental protection laws, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, but the policies were not operating because local government just would deny. And in some cases, there were no policies to deal with what we were dealing with, what we were addressing, i.e. the Environmental Justice Executive Order is not law. So the city of Mebane, Alamance County government could say, well, it's not law, so we don't have to follow it. And of course, you know already that Alamance County is still fighting over a Confederate monument. Last week, the NAACP that sued Alamance County by removing the Confederate monument got a ruling that says they are allowed to keep the Confederate monument there. So we're living in another century, right? We're adjoining counties. This is one of the most progressive counties, Guilford County politically. Orange County on the other side of Alamance County, again, the same. And Alamance County is like one of the most conservative counties in the whole state and in the South. So how do you get past all this, even though you have laws for compliance and enforcement under civil rights laws and executive orders, when people just deny and just say they're not going to comply? How do environmental justice communities access EJ silos? That's the question we're raising. In our case, the Zeisman Friends Foundation was one of the first organizations that funded us in 1997. And of course, you know, the Zeisman Friends Foundation is in Winston-Salem. And they shared some stuff with us in 1997 in some closed meetings when we were contacted and said, we want to fund you to address some of these issues because you're one of the first groups in North Carolina that's doing this the way you're doing it, right? And this was during the time we were getting ready to file a complaint with the United States Department of Justice. He said, we're going to share with you this thing called a 12 disciples approach. Never heard of it before. They said, 12 disciples approaches, this has a religious connotation, and I'm not trying to offend anybody, but basically they said, well, you pick and vet your disciples. As a community group, you have a right to pick who you're going to work with. And if you have 12 disciples, community collaborators, whether government, university, community partners, whatever, and you sit down and talk to them about your issue and your problem, and they decide, yes, we're going to do this, but you have some that don't want to do this, they don't want to leverage things to correct the problem, then as a leader of the group, in the middle of that bubble we showed you earlier, that West End Revitalization Association we set up, if there are 3 or 4 that do not want to do, you ask them to leave your circle. And Ezekiel Reynolds told us that you have a right to do that. So a lot of community groups don't feel like they have the right to dismiss white folks or pastors or a local county official from your circle to solve your problem. They said you have to leverage that power. You may not have any money, right? But you have a voice for your community and be able to speak for your community. We said, oh, okay. So we started doing that. And we started asking people to put it in writing and sign, and asking people to walk away, and they did. And then you replace those disciples with other people who want to work to solve your issue. Whether they're attorneys, and we dismissed some attorneys too in the past. The Western Revitalization Association in the early 2000s worked with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law out of Washington, D.C. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law was set up by John F. Kennedy a few months before he passed away, before he was assassinated, because he concluded that the Congress was not going to be able to address a lot of environmental justice or civil rights issues in the United States. So this law firm now has offices all across the country, including North Carolina. So they were one of the pro bono lawyers that was identified to work with us with our issues in North Carolina, pro bono. So they gave us another term. It's called the Come to the Legal Altar. I said, what does that mean? They said, you ask your local government officials to address your issues based on the law. Or you violated the Civil Rights Law, or you violated Title VI, Clean Water Act, State Drinking Water, all those laws that Jack mentioned earlier. And if they're not addressing those things, it's a very friendly approach. But it's professional, where lawyers came to Midland and talked to the mayor, talked to the city manager. They came to city council meetings to observe and that kind of thing. They had private meetings, open meetings, and asked them, do you know you're violating these laws based on these black and brown people you're withholding rights to, basic amenities to? Yes, do you want to talk about it? And of course, some people would say, well, just get the hell out of here. Okay. You damn Yankees and Midland, go back to Washington, D.C., where we come. We weren't met the way we want. I mean, it was pretty open and pretty blatant. So, okay, well, let's do it another way then. So we filed administrative complaints with the United States Department of Justice because they did not want to talk. In 2022, the United States Department of Justice asked our organization to be a part of a community-led meetings that were virtual, over 2 or 3 meetings, to help the United States Department of Justice set up an Office of Environmental Justice at the United States Department of Justice. I mean, get this now. We filed a complaint in 1999, so we were one of the first groups in the United States that filed a complaint about environmental justice that used Title VI and referenced the Environmental Justice Executive Order 12898 in the United States. We did not know it. We were unusual. So in 2022, I mean, this is 23 years later, they asked us to come back, and you're still alive, and you're still there. Will you talk to us and our brand new attorneys about setting up our Office of Environmental Justice to do what you did informally, to do it formally now for the United States Department of Justice under this President Harris Biden? And we said, what? We were not the only ones. There was, I think, 25 other groups throughout the country. I said, okay, so now you have a legal standing at the United States Department of Justice to do what we did already. The other one was some senior attorneys said to us, you're doing a lot of talking like we're doing here now. We're traveling all over the country. You need to get some develop a memorandum of understanding about how you communicate with lawyers, community groups, colleges, and universities when people ask you to speak about what it is they want you to do and how you want to do it to protect your rights. And the other one was a memorandum of agreement. That this agreement says you're going to pay me for this month, you're going to pay me for my travel, you're going to pay me for my hotel, and this is how long I want to speak, etc. So it's called a memorandum of agreement. So we've incorporated those things and been using those things and sharing some of that information with various groups, with the American Public Health Association, the Citizen Science Association, etc. Right? We said you just don't want to talk about it, you want to do something about it. You want to take action based on the JEDI principles that we said before. That's the end of my part of it, and quickly I'm going to talk about my wife. My wife is also co-founder, and she was a school teacher for 35 years. We went to graduate school together at Bowling Green State University. We were recruited in the middle 70s to integrate Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. They were integrating the school before Carolina was doing some of the integration, before University of North Carolina, Greensboro was doing some of that. So we were recruited out of North Carolina, out of Shore University, to go all the way to Ohio and have our tuition and fees and all kinds of stuff paid to integrate the graduate school program there, where there was about maybe 60 students of color and another 20 or something from Africa and South America out of about 10,000 students. And there was only one permanent black resident. They had just hired and bought a police chief. I won't say bought, they paid him, they gave a house to him to be the first permanent black resident of that Bowling Green, the city of Bowling Green. And the odd part about it, Bowling Green had been one of the last stops of the Underground Railroad to Canada during slavery time. They said, wait a minute, this is weird. How could this city not have black residents? And it was one of the stations of the Underground Railroad where you actually scurried people through resident basements to Canada for freedom. It did make sense to us. And then, 100-some years later, you're still trying to integrate to the university. It was strange. But in any case, my wife was a special education teacher. She got her degree. She finished her master's degree at Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi. So she taught school at McLaurin Elementary School in Brandon, Mississippi. This is one of the replacement schools they built after we left. Excuse me, and came to North Carolina, back to North Carolina in 1986, 87. And she also continued her educational work at New Hope Elementary School in Orange County. We have a big issue in Alamance County. You may have heard on the news this week that Alamance County school system is under dire situations. They had to spend $25 million, blew the budget to get rid of black mold. They had to shut down the whole school system, 36 schools, including a brand new school, right? Last summer because of black mold exposure. But the money was spent to get rid of most of the black mold for 27 schools, but the money wasn't spent to correct the leaking roofs or leaking pipes that cause the black mold. So now the school is fighting to keep the state school system from taking over the school because of all these inequities that's created by the government, the county and the city who run it. So the black mold robs IQ, it robs health of teachers, custodial staff, and all those people who clean up yards and all this kind of stuff. So basically my wife is concerned that she's dealt with this throughout her 35 years of teaching career in Mississippi, in Ohio when she was training there, and North Carolina, Alamance, Orange County, and it just kind of burns her head over her head. Because she taught special education still all of her life, those with disabilities that were exposed to various kinds of things that cause to rob their physical disability, intellectual disability, emotional, they cause emotional harm, so they would never, quote unquote, fulfill everything in their life, right? So Alamance County is struggling with this now. Bernie Sanders asked us to provide input on a national policy called a Green New Deal for Public Education to come up with $1.36 trillion over 10 years to correct some of this inequity. The bill was never passed, but recently the Biden-Harris administration got the state legislature to come up with some money that was peeled out of some of these bills, the Affordable Care Act, the IRA, the bipartisan infrastructure, and millions of that dollar money is coming to North Carolina and every state to go through every school in North Carolina to evaluate lead contamination in drinking water and fountains, including this county. And if you don't know about it, you need to check with your school system. That's what to do. To check with your school system, when they're gonna do it, which schools have black mold, has it been cleaned up, when it's gonna be cleaned? Those are questions you need to ask here. Because the people in the communities, i.e. like West Baton, like West End, like other parts of Greensboro that Jasmine talked about earlier, if these children and communities are exposed to environmental justice issues, and they go to school and they're exposed to environmental justice issues, how do they escape it? You know, they just can't run away from home. They could, you know. But how do they escape it? They have to be protected some kind of way. And it's our responsibility to do that. And my wife is saying that we have environmental justice schools that are not being put on the list. And you, as parents and grandparents and brothers and sisters, need to contact your schools tomorrow and next week and the week after next to see what they're doing to correct these issues with lead pipes, black mold, and other kinds of issues, leaky roofs, that deprives them of a healthy education, and your teachers, because it causes a difficult problem to recruit. Can you imagine what Alamance County is doing now, trying to recruit teachers? And the ones that are there are leaving under this kind of situation of mismanagement, and a lot of them is so based on race and racial division and redlining. And I'd like to thank you for hearing me and sharing some of the words of my wife, and I'm glad to be here and be with my colleague, attorney Jasmine Washington.
So let me turn our engaged portion over to Orpheus Williams with the equity line.
Good evening, everyone. Hello. Really brief. They might be just yes. Work with the Equity Lab doing liberatory, anti-racist DEI conversations around the country with schools, organizations, public and private. Really happy to be able to support the work that's happening here in North Carolina, in Greensboro specifically. So my job is to help you all engage with all of the content that you just received, but not in the sort of traditional way of jumping directly into a Q&A. I'm actually going to give you all an opportunity to process and talk through some of the impressions of what you just heard. Okay. Oh, can you all hear me in the back? All right. I'm going to give you a chance to process and to discuss some of the things that you just heard with somebody that's close to you. And here's the reason why. A big part of this isn't figuring out what question to ask the presenters to get that golden ticket or that silver bullet that's going to be the response that's going to make things change. A big part of this is you figuring out in your sphere of influence, which may or may not include the person that's close to you, what can you do to add to the efforts that are happening here? And the speakers deserve the opportunity to hear that from you before the questions. I'll give you a couple of examples. My head was spinning, and I appreciated filling in lots of gaps of things that I didn't know. But some of the messages that I took away, if you don't have the money or are deemed unworthy due to race or class, you may be forced or designed to live in the worst possible environment. And that made me think of the concept of generations. Generations over 100 years, generations usually 15 to 20 years on average. So that means with, and I'm gonna get it right, West Baton, 5 generations at least were denied access to just a healthy place to live. And I add that to what Omega was talking about, that 5 generations of children that are now set back in some way, both in health and education, and their families are now 100 years, 5 generations, back from those who were living in those more affluent and healthy areas. And people ask, well, why don't they just move out? Well, it's not possible. It also made me think of the importance and the significance of generational responsibility. Now, lovingly, I just met these folks. We met for the first time here in person, we met online. And I was struck by a comment that Omega made about executive order, and pardon me, I don't remember the number. But the way he phrased it, he said executive order, let's call it 5. And then Jasmine talked about executive order 7. Realizing that this is a generational thing that's happening right here. We talk a lot about, well, what can the next generation do? Omega hasn't disengaged, and Jasmine is picking up exactly on the fight where he is left off, and where he's continuing to support. That is a phenomenon that fits into the museum that I had a chance to see today when I think about, well, how does the fight continue? He also talked about rules of engagement. That last slide in the concept of civil rights was a blueprint. I want that slide. Because people say, what am I supposed to do of it? That was a blueprint that Jasmine has been following in her actions, whether conscious or not. It was very specific, but that was the definition of disobey civilly. That was a complete definition of it. So those examples are some of the things that, as far as impressions that I'm taking from it, and I'm sharing with you now. I'm asking you to find a partner or turn to a partner next to you. Take the next 5 minutes. What landed with you? What do you want to challenge? What were surprises? And what were confirmations? So take 5 minutes just to yourselves, and I'll bring you back in about 5 minutes. So like I said, we're going to start with impressions. I know you have questions. I promise you'll be able to ask questions as you see fit, but we just want to start with sharing our impressions. And me coming close to you doesn't mean I'm going to pick on you, so I'll wait for you to raise your hand. But impressions, questions, see what I did. Impressions, reactions, comments, anyone?
Hi, my name is Mindy, and I work with Jasmine at the Southern Environmental Law Center, and I just wanted to sort of emphasize what Jasmine was saying about her example working with Alcoa. I remember getting the DEQ monitoring reports for those. I don't know if you recall that map she had up there. It had the little teal dots for the outfalls. But I remember seeing the discharge reports from DEQ that we would get monthly for those outfalls and mixing zones. And when Jasmine's talking about those areas being polluted, I'm talking high pollution, aluminum, fluoride, chlorine, PCBs, cyanide in excess of what the EPA, they have guidelines that they deem, I guess, safe. And these were in excess of like 1,000 times higher in some instances than what is deemed, safe for, human consumption or, the water or whatnot. But I think one of the pictures that I remember seeing at our office or in one of our slides that resonated most with me, and we didn't have it here this evening, is there was a picture, I think it may have been posted either at Yadkin or at Baden Lake, that showed, do not eat the fish that is consumed here. And it's really unfortunate because you have a lot of people that, fish and, they take that fish home and they eat, but, you would get sick from eating the fish. And, I wouldn't let my children, if it were me, swim in Baden Lake, which is unfortunate. It's a beautiful lake. And my husband, who is an avid four-wheeler, with Jeeps and stuff, we used to go to Uwharrie and camp there. And, I was just sharing with you, it's almost a curse, but yet a blessing to work for SCLC because you see, you're privy to information about, certain water bodies and, certain areas, and I don't camp at Uwharrie anymore because I'm not going to let my 2-year-old anywhere near, Baden Lake. I'm not going to have anything to do with certain areas in North Carolina, and it's really unfortunate, but that's just my comment, and just to let you know that yes, it's polluted, but it's heavily polluted, and I don't think people realize that there's cyanide in their water in great levels sometimes. Still, as early as 2022, I think is the last report I looked at, but
It's still there.
yeah, it's still there. But yeah, and that's really it. It's sad. It's sad that you can't enjoy Hyder Lake. It's sad that you can't enjoy bathing lake. It said that you can't enjoy Cape Fear River. Do not get me started on water. I mean, Cape Fear River is one of the most biodiverse waters in, you know, the southeast, and it's also one of the most polluted. So, yeah, that's it. That's my 2 cents.
Just really, then, no matter what regulations are put in place, it comes back to us to make noise about it and actually create change, because no matter what regulations are in place, they're still not at safe levels, and there's no one checking to see or really going to stop it unless we take action and we speak up about it and try to get those regulations enforced and new ones put in place where necessary.
I've been through the town of Dayton over a dozen times on the way to Laurel Mountain State Park, and I have many times gone past that beach and said, boy, some hot day I'm going to stop there and go swimming. So, which just making the point that you can be so oblivious at something that's there and not realizing. On the other hand, Laurel Mountain State Park's really interesting because there's thousands of years of natives, indigenous people going there and making their weapons or their tools, their implements from the rock that's up there on top. So I mean, human beings leave their mark, but unfortunately, we've got to do an awful lot better at not leaving, particularly that type of mark that damages our own selves.
There are definitely lessons about environmental balance and harmony that we, as a society of non-Indigenous folks, have not adopted. And I'm not only talking about the people in this room, but the folks that are policymakers that are contributing to the larger dumping of this stuff over years. All right, open it up for questions for our panelists.
Well, and while you're going to that person, two of y'all mentioned kind of the nature around Baden Lake, and I just want to emphasize that yeah, there's on the other side of the lake and kind of north of the town of Baden, right there, is a really beautiful, one of only 3 national forests in North Carolina is on Baden Lake. And then just a little bit southeast of that is Morrow Mountain State Park. That's a really beautiful state park and just sort of in the shadow of the pollution of Alcoa.
And then I have 2 questions. My first question is, America is fundamentally based on inequality, right? And so, not even environmental justice, but justice in general is an attempt to bring more equality. But if we're fundamentally based upon inequality itself, America's going to become a poor country, right? And in this sense, we're going to lose the political distribution between the elites and the many is going to change substantially. Do you think that in some ways by advocating for environmental and justice in general, you're advocating for an American revolution? And my second question is that nonprofits are ultimately, in my view, delayers of environmental change because they're protecting us from dangerous levels of suffrage. Do you think nonprofits should participate in some form of willful incompetence so that the suffrage and movements, end up encapsulating a bigger and larger group of people so that change happens quicker? Or do you think, people should just keep delaying and delaying and delaying the inevitable?
Big question.
First of all,
Roll cameras.
First of all, we're both nonprofits, right? The Southern Environmental Law Center and the West Indian Revitalization Association. We're both nonprofits, so I hope you're not talking about solving the problem because we've been very much involved in solving the problem. As far as the environmental justice part of it, that there's going to be a revolution. There's some international meetings that have been held recently, and several countries are addressing this issue, right, of pollution and disparities among indigenous. When we think about indigenous, we think about Native Americans here in North Carolina, or in the state, the federal, or the United States. But there are other countries that refer to their indigenous populations too. i.e. Australia and the Falklands, Hawaii, by the way, right? And other places in Canada and Mexico. A lot of people think Mexico is inhabited by people who are Latino, but Mexico was inhabited by indigenous populations long before, right? And a lot of times people forget that. So a lot of other countries are involved in trying to deal with corrective action. So, and a lot of the funders of our organization and other major and small nonprofits are nonprofits who are trying to correct it. So I think that's a misunderstanding of what you're saying, that is contrary to what is actually happening. And of course, these federal laws, the executive order, this is where elected officials reach in for black and white, indigenous, a lot of women, a whole lot of women, are pushing for these corrective actions at the federal level. So for the very first time, we have federal monies, for the very first time in a significant amount, coming to do the water testing I was saying about with the public schools. This is coming out of the Biden-Harris administration. So the issue has been raised all the way back for 40-some years with environmental justice, corrective action. But in this particular administration, some of the footprint was created under the Clinton administration. It was made bigger with the election of President Obama. And a lot of the things are now being implemented with funding. JEDI, I said integrity, inclusion, with funding. It's actually been implemented under congressional law, bipartisan law, that Republicans and independents and Democrats alike have voted on, right? So the wheel is turning in a more positive way, but there's always, like somebody putting on the brakes, right? And as I mentioned before, Alamance County elected officials keep putting on the brakes or throwing out anchors when other counties are trying to do the opposite. It's always a push and pull issue. But to identify the nonprofit organizations of being in the way of it, some of the largest funders of organizations like ours are nonprofits. They're not all the same, of course, who are trying to put monies in front of what the government didn't do 30 years ago to correct some of the problems and bring people in places like this, like White Voices Against Racism. I think it's a nonprofit, right?
Yes.
To correct some of the problems. So I think that's a misnomer. So maybe we need to talk about how you're addressing those things, because that's not quite the way things are actually happening. Thanks.
Well, I'll just add, so I think what I heard the question to be is whether nonprofits should take a seat back and let consequences actually happen. Kind of like if you have a kid, sometimes you have to let them put their hand on the stove so they can, know that the stove is hot. I think for me, I understand the concept, I understand the idea. I disagree with it because I recognize that at the end of the day, the people who are going to be impacted from that, from letting the baby touch the stove, are going to be poor people. Like, it's going to be people who don't have the resources to protect themselves against the outcome. And, the people at the top, the wealthy people who actually, cause a lot of the corporations that actually, cause or their actions are contributing the most to these harms, they're going to be fine. They will be able to protect themselves, and so they aren't going to feel the hurt that comes down as a consequence of those actions. And so I think that, for nonprofits to take a back seat and let the consequences happen would just be creating more sacrifice zones. It would be putting a lot more communities in harm's way to ideally make a point, but that is a point that I don't think would actually reach the audience that it needs to reach and kind of and actually cause the baby to take his hand off the stove the way that ideally one would think it would. So I appreciate the question, but I disagree. I don't think that nonprofits should take a back seat and let the consequences flow.
Just quickly to bullet point it, the organization that was the first funder of ours, the Western Revitalization Association in 1997, Zephyr's Rentals, that's a nonprofit. It's one of the largest nonprofits in the South, right? the lawyers for civil rights under law out of Washington DC. They provide pro bono legal service. Pro bono means they were doing legal work for us for free, right? From funds they have raised from major nonprofits, that's also a nonprofit. We're going back 30 years. So, we have to get some education on what that means and who you're talking about. All nonprofits are just like the politics. They're independent nonprofits that do work, and then nonprofits that are very conservative, and nonprofits that are blue, as we say with these blue East Coast, and then nonprofits that are extremely blue, who are very, what we call very progressive. So they have that political swing just like any other kind of organization.
All right, and this is why, and this is the importance of having dialogue, open dialogue where everyone can hear. I'll put a piece of food for thought out for everybody. And I've thought about this as we talked about the concept of environment. If this fails, there's a certain section of people right now that are experimenting on what another environment would be, meaning another planetary environment or another interstellar environment. It is not recreation. So some folks out there are betting on either scenario to play out in some way. And just asking yourself, where would we here, I'm assuming nobody here is a billionaire or an astronaut. Maybe a poor assumption. But where would we here fit into that plan if we don't have conversations like this to have alignment in some way? Because that resistance gets strengthened if we're on the same page about the kind of concepts that we're talking about here. And just, again, food for thought, asking yourselves these questions. But thank you all for sharing, thank you all for the questions, and we'll move on to the action piece, the act piece.
With Blue Rose Cloud, the new platform made in partnership with the creators of WordPress, lightning fast websites, 100% network uptime, 24/7 priority tech support. Experience Blue Rose Cloud at bluerose.com.
So that was one example of action, and maybe that was a revolution that was taking place there in Flint, Michigan. I've passed out the index cards, and if you don't have a pen, raise your hand. We can run a pen to you. Someone says, "That's not all students should have a pen, Mark." Well, maybe, maybe not. But what we want you to do with the index card is on one side of it, we want you to write down 3 actions that you think that you could take to address environmental justice issues. 3 things that you think you could do to address environmental justice issues. Now, yes, of course, we're going to come in and ask, does anyone wish to share one or more of the actions that they think they could take? If you're so bold to go first, you may be giving someone else an idea of something to do.
I want to give you guys my action item, but I want to couple that with the question that I didn't get a chance to ask. But my action item is to get educated, and tonight really showed me how much I don't know. And that's okay to not know something, but I want to find out the information. So my question to you guys is, as new businesses, new infrastructure, anything new that impacts the residents or coming into our communities. What responsibility do our governments, leadership entities have to inform the community? Of course, I know about town halls and public meetings, public comment periods for different types of boards and commissions, that sort of thing. But if you don't know that you should attend, what to ask when you attend, what those concerns should be, and if those entities don't tell you what those concerns are and how they've addressed them and how they plan to mitigate them in the future, then just not knowing kind of sits you behind the 8 ball. And just to give you a little bit of why I asked that question, we live in Plainsville, North Carolina, outside of the city of Greensboro, still within the city limits, so to speak. And when we moved into our neighborhood about 15 years ago, it was a predominantly white neighborhood at the time. There has since been a mass exodus. The neighborhood is now predominantly African American. Thank you. But what we've noticed and what we've been excited about is the number of manufacturing companies that are coming into the area, not too far from where we live. We were excited about job opportunities for our community. But with that, we've also noticed the increase in traffic. Highways have expanded around us. We hear more noise at night. And just all those things that only as you're speaking that it's really starting to click for us. We're also not far from the landfill in Greensboro. My husband does lawn care, so we frequent that landfill often to dump leaves and things like that. And so we've noticed that that landfill is always full. You know, things that used to seem like they were small piles, they're bigger piles. We've also noticed what you kind of shared, those workers at that landfill. We've commented to one another quite often that the workers that are busting open the bags and dealing with the waste, they tend to be African American, a minority at both the landfill and then the other dump site, the hazardous waste facility. So we've noted those things, but again, until you started speaking about it, it's only starting to click as I'm listening. So therefore, the education piece. But had I not been sitting here, had I not had this kind of concern, you know, I feel like I'm a little bit more astute than maybe others might be, but even still, I'm behind the 8 ball. What responsibility does our government have, does our leadership in our community have to inform its citizens as we're incenting companies to come in and so forth and so on? And I know that was a little long-winded, but from a legal standpoint, what responsibilities do they have?
Very little. No, so I mean, it is not uncommon. It is not an uncommon practice for county commissioners and kind of local decision makers to recruit industries to come to town and work out a deal behind closed doors of different tax incentives and things like that. And then for the community not to find out about it until some local organizer randomly goes to a city council meeting and they mention that this company is going to need some sort of environmental permit, and that is the first that the community is hearing about this company coming. So I mean, the best way to stay kind of on top of that sort of thing is to literally just stay in contact with your local government. Go to commissioner meetings, go to city council meetings, because oftentimes that is when those decisions are being made and being talked about, and that is, how they kind of see their duty to inform the public. Once again, a lot of what might be coming out in those meetings might be decisions that have already essentially been made. But it's probably one of the earliest ways to stay involved. That, and then kind of tapping into whatever local organizations are kind of keeping tabs on those type of things. A lot of our work at Southern Environmental Law Center comes from local organizers and people on the ground who are saying like, hey, I was at a city council meeting and they were talking about, this this pellet mill coming to town, and that doesn't seem like a good thing to me. What can we do about it? Or like, I was reading the newspaper and, there was a little blurb about, some company coming to town. What can we do about it? Because in reality, they don't have to put an ad on the front page as soon as they get, a bid from a company to move in. Like I said, those decisions are oftentimes made, behind closed doors, and it's not until some sort of environmental permit is necessary that a lot of the potential harm of an industry comes out. I'll also add that I am happy that you're here, that you're learning and making those connections. You know, I will be the first to admit that, I mean, that was me growing up. Like, you don't always necessarily recognize the injustices that are in front of your eyes because they're normal. You know, like, you just, like, we all just kind of, like, you know, we as black folks just kind of know that, like, yeah, there's a black side of town and there's a lot of bad stuff over there. But, like, you don't really think about it being, and you know that, you know, bad things happen in other places to make it that way, but you don't really think about it being the thing that is also happening right in front of your eyes. And so it really does take, you know, events like this and like educating yourself to realize that, like, oh no, that is a pattern, like that is a systematic issue, and I am now a part of that system, and that is now happening, you know, all around me. And, you know, once you get woke, it's, you know, it's hard to go back, so. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I might be a little biased because I'm an elections director. And if you think one vote doesn't matter, you don't understand. So I just want to say, I didn't write anything down, but this would be it. There's our League of Women Voters up there. Not only can you learn by going to these meetings or keeping up, you can go and let these officials know during public comment period how you feel about their decisions, whether you agree with them or not. And they have to run for office every 2 to 4 to 6 years. And if enough people let folks know that you're not happy about these decisions, they will at some point have to recognize that they're not very popular for their decisions. So please don't forget to vote.
Because I will say with that, I mean, you know, even giving your local officials and state officials the benefit of the doubt, you know, if they don't have a counter narrative or a counter concern to this industry coming to town, they are not inclined to act. And so, you know, if this company comes to them and says, I'm gonna bring all these jobs and don't worry, you know, we might have to get like a little bit of air permit, but like, it's fine. You know, if they don't kind of hear any pushback from the public, it's like, oh, well, why wouldn't we say yes? So yeah, it's important to vote, and it's important to go to those meetings, make comments, make your voices heard, because oftentimes they're not well attended, and so, you know, your presence can make a difference.
And just a quick addition to what Jasmine said about the idea of normalizing this kind of reality. Obviously, it's important for young black and brown children to realize this is not the way it's supposed to be. It's not your fault. This is not genetic. It's equally as important for young white children to understand this is not the way it's supposed to be. That's not who they are. That's not who we are. So I just want to make that point of emphasis on both sides.
Quickly to add, I think it's something important to understand when it comes to people of color and in general. I can't see back, I think he's still back there. They raised the question earlier. When you speak at public hearings, one of the things we learned early on when we started working with the Department of Justice is a lot of people like to make comments, and sometimes they make them very heated. And they don't even remember what they said. But one of the things that we learned is write those comments down in cogent fashion. 3 or 4 good paragraphs, 1 page is enough, and 12 font. You know, like a letter, formal letter, with your name, address, contact information, and make sure when you make your presentation that you are asked, that you are allowed to give a copy to every city council person, so they know who you are, your street address and who you are, and it separates you from the rest of the people making comments. And that same information can be used to file to your state elected official for your area, for your state, and your representative at the United States government level, to say that you think your county officials or your city officials are not addressing noise pollution or water pollution. And you look for a response. You are asking for a written response from your city official. You're asking for a written response from your elected official at the state level, or your county commissioners, or your United States congressional. I mean, it takes an effort to do this. This is the question that was being raised earlier. What are you going to do? This is one of the processes. So when you get responses or don't get responses, like in 90 days, you have the right to file a formal complaint based on what you said, when you said it, who you talked to, and who didn't answer. And if they did answer you in a written way, right, very often you might be surprised. Some of the most conservative people in your community or elected officials may answer you. So don't limit it to just Democrats or Republicans. Send it to everybody that's in your area. that quote unquote represents her area. You might be surprised sometimes. So you can use those responses to file formal complaints under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, the Executive Order 12898. So you learn how to put bullet points on this based on the regulations that are in place already. And it is not going to be a one-shot deal, and a lot of people want to come to a city council meeting, county commission meeting, very intellectually or sometimes very angrily and say something in 3 minutes before they shut you off and think you're going to change the world. It doesn't happen that way. It has to be consistent and ongoing and documented, and you can't be afraid to let them know who you are and to move it to the next level and the next level and the next level and the next level in order to get anything done. We had to learn that. After 4 years of doing what you said you're talking about, we decided to put it in writing and file formal complaints, and all of a sudden, the world started changing. When we filed formal complaints outside of the state of North Carolina, outside of our county, outside of our city, that's important to do. Taxpayers, workers, residents, owners, right? You have a right to do this, and this is one of the things that we were told we were not doing by the Department of Justice. Exercise your rights. Do not just talk and do nothing. Jedi. Do Jedi. Remember those. And operationalize them in everything you do relative to these issues. Thank you.
Anyone else want to share or have a question?
The city of Greensboro tells you on their website they'll welcome your email or your communication, but they won't necessarily answer you. That's been my experience. So when you talk about these are fantastic, instructions you're giving us, but are they just having an out by saying that? Because they don't get in touch. My representative doesn't get in touch. They don't.
I'm not saying that they're going to automatically answer you. I'm just saying it leaves you the opportunity to say that this is what you asked and this is what the responses you didn't or didn't get. So if you want to take the initiative, you have the right. If it's an issue of water quality, you have a right to file a formal complaint in the United States Department of Environmental Protection Agency. That's Michael Regan, who graduated from AT, his office. He's not a person, he's a personal person. They have all these subdivisions and stuff. Then you have a right to file complaints at other levels. So you cannot leave these kind of issues that are environmental justice or environmental issues that are based on federal law at the local government to respond to.
I see.
You have to be willing to climb that hill.
So the
to
fact
take
that
it to
they
the next
claim they're not gonna necessarily answer you doesn't mean I can't take all the steps that you've pointed out.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. That's great.
I'm not sure about, the specific proceedings for the city of Greensboro, but, generally, when government agencies are taking formal administrative actions and making certain formal decisions, if you comment, in that process, then they, depending on the type of action that they're taking, they do have to provide some sort of response to your comment. So even if, your comment is completely off the wall and it doesn't matter, they have to acknowledge that basically this is the type of comment we received and this is our response to that. And that response could be, it is not within our jurisdiction to do that. But they do, with certain administrative actions, have to provide some sort of response to your comment.
Other questions or actions?
One of the things I wrote down, I work for a trucking company off of 40, and I saw an article several months ago about the Colonial Pipeline there having incredibly high levels of pollutants being released, and so just pushing for more regular or consistent testing of pollutant levels at industrial sites and harsh penalties for violations and stuff like that, and just continuing to educate myself and the people around me about how to affect change in these areas.
You just brought up a really good point, and that's the fine amounts. Oftentimes, for these corporations, the fines for violating their permits are pennies. Like, you're talking about a couple $100 that they got caught violating their permit, that they have to pay like maybe twice a year, something like that. So you're talking about like literal pennies to these organizations.
You are a trucker, is that what you said?
I work for one of the trucking companies there, yes.
Okay. Have you ever heard of the term glider? Do you know what a glider is?
Yes.
Wow, I'm great. All right, that's great. We were part of a group, we were the only group in 2018 that co-signed a complaint about stopping gliders from being released on the highway in the state of North Carolina. And the co-signature, I'll tell you what it is to say. The co-signature was Josh Stein, who's the Attorney General for the state of North Carolina. We were the only community group in the state of North Carolina, along with Josh Stein, who signed this complaint, along with 18 other Attorney Generals for states throughout the country and 11 other community groups throughout the country. And this came under the previous presidential administration, right, that wanted to allow gliders to be released on the highways in North Carolina and throughout the country, because North Carolina makes gliders. They were making gliders. Explain, right? A glider is a tractor trailer truck. The engine, the tractor is the engine that pulls the cargo. They call them tractors, tractor trailers, right? And in this particular case, there were companies who were making brand new cabs. Everything was brand new and shiny, except the motor was 20 years old. So the motor would pollute in violation of the Clean Air Act, right? So this is technical craziness, right? So you make a brand new truck, but you put an old motor in it that you got from a dump yard. You clean the motor up and it works, but it's a heavy polluter, and you've seen tractor trailer trucks that blows out all the blue and gray smoke. So they weren't in compliance. So the previous presidential administration wanted to make it legal to mass produce glider trucks. So truckers could buy the truck that looked brand new on the outside, but the motor was old, so they could save $30,000 on that particular truck. And they wanted to make it legal under the Trump administration. So a group of people wanted community groups who were familiar with transportation issues, because we filed a complaint, highway issues for our community, to sign on this national complaint to stop it. And it went to the United States Superior Court in Washington, D.C., because we signed it. And we were the group, the only community group in North Carolina that co-signed it. And it stopped it. And the idea, just think about this. If you went and bought a brand new Mercedes, right, and it had an engine that was 20 years old in it, would you want it? I mean, if you bought a brand new Toyota and had an engine in it that was 20 years old with smoke blowing out of it, would you want it? I mean, just think about, this is coming from the federal government because a president said they wanted it done. This is the Trump administration, obviously we're talking. Why did he do this? Because the companies who were making glider trucks were a major contributor to his campaign to be elected. This is EPA. And the person he elected, assigned to run the EPA, approved it until he was ran out of office. And we were one of the groups in the country that was asked to sign the complaint to stop this process. And it won. When they hit the courts in Washington, D.C., in a week, the courts eliminated this particular rule that this president wanted to put in place to eliminate environmental laws that the Southern Environmental Law Center works on, and community groups like ours fight to keep your lungs and your children and your asthma and your lives healthy and safe. So I'm glad you know what a glider is, and a whole lot of you now know what gliders are. If you look up glider trucks, you will find it. But everybody I talked to about it was just said, this is crazy. How could, this makes no sense. But it had to do with politics and money
and eliminating the environmental laws that the Southern Environmental Law Center works on to keep in place, like the young man in the back said earlier. People who are violating the law, this is a herd of elephants again. In this case, one of the big herds of the elephant was the president, who wanted to eliminate laws that protect your health, your body, your wellness, because of corporate money. And the code term was making glider trucks.
So I just realized, I thought, wow, we've got 50 minutes. I'm looking at the clock there. Plenty of time, but actually we're a little past 8. Your last thing that we ask you to do is take your card with your 3 things that you think you could do and mark through them. Mark through them. And then turn the card over and write down the one thing that you are going to do. And when you do that, if you have a breast pocket, put it in your breast pocket near your heart, because this is what you're going to do. And then finally, I'm not going to go back and try to play the other video, but please go look at it. It was a big hit last night, How to Start a Movement.
So ladies and gentlemen, at TED we talk a lot about leadership and how to make a movement. So let's watch a movement happen, start to finish, in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons from it. First, of course you know, a leader needs the guts to stand out and be ridiculed. But what he's doing is so easy to follow. So here's his first follower with a crucial role. He's going to show everyone else how to follow. Now notice that the leader embraces him as an equal. So now it's not about the leader anymore, it's about them, plural. Now there he is calling to his friends. Now if you notice that the first follower is actually an underestimated form of leadership in itself. It takes guts to stand out like that. The first follower is what transforms a lone nut into a leader. And here comes a second follower. Now it's not a lone nut, it's not 2 nuts, 3 is a crowd, and a crowd is news. So a movement must be public. It's important to show not just the leader, but the followers, because you find that new followers emulate the followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, and immediately after, 3 more people. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point. Now we've got a movement. So, notice that as more people join in, it's less risky. So those that were sitting on the fence before now have no reason not to. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, but they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. So, over the next minute, you'll see all of the those that prefer to stick with the crowd, because eventually they would be ridiculed for not joining in. And that's how you make a movement. But let's recap some lessons from this. So first, if you are the type, like the shirtless dancing guy, that is standing alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals. So it's clearly about the movement, not you. Okay, but we might have missed the real lesson here. The biggest lesson, if you noticed, did you catch it? Is that leadership is over-glorified. That yes, it was the shirtless guy was first, and he'll get all the credit, but it was really the first follower that transformed the lone nut into a leader. So as we're told that we should all be leaders, that would be really ineffective. If you really care about starting a movement, have the courage to follow and show others how to follow. And when you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first one to stand up and join in. And what a perfect place to do that, TED. Thanks.
All right, well, that's good enough for now, because we are done for the evening. Thank you all very much.